Good morning, boys and girls. I am Miss Nicole, and I am a literacy coach with the Mississippi Department of Education.
Good morning, boys and girls. I am Miss Delphine, and I am a literacy coach with the Mississippi Department of Education also.
We are glad that you could join us today. In today's lesson, we will learn about the Native Americans.
Miss Nicole, did you know that Native Americans were the first known people to live on the continents of North and South America?
Wow, Miss Delphine, please tell me more.
Another term for Native American is American Indian. There are many different groups of Native Americans. These groups are called tribes. The Lakota Sioux, the Wampanoag, and the Lenape are just a few of the Native American tribes.
Miss Delphine, I've heard of the Lakota Sioux, the Wampanoag, but I have never heard of the Lenape.
So, in today's lesson, you will discuss what Native Americans ate, how they dressed, and their homes.
So, by the end of today's lesson, we will be able to recall that Native Americans were the first known inhabitants of North America, explain that although there are many diverse tribes of Native Americans, they all needed food, clothing, and shelter to survive. So, before we begin today's lessons, let's discuss some words that we will reference throughout the lesson. These words will help us better understand what we are reading. Let's take a look, boys and girls, at our anchor chart for our vocabulary. The first word is borrow. Say it with me, boys and girls.
Borrow.
Yes, that's it. Borrow means to take or use something for a while and then return it.
Miss Nicole, can I borrow your pointer?
Yes, Miss Delphine, you can, but make sure you return it. Our next word, boys and girls, is coast. Say it with me.
Coast.
A coast is the land next to the sea or ocean. Another word for coast is the shore. Our next word is deserts. Say it with me, boys and girls.
Deserts.
Deserts are large, dry areas with little rain.
Miss Nicole, if you visit the desert, you will need plenty of water because there is very little water in the desert.
You are absolutely right, Miss Delphine. Our next word is roamed. Say it with me, boys and girls. Roamed. Roamed means wandered or moved around. The herd roamed the countryside looking for food. Our next word is shelter. Say it with me, boys and girls. Shelter.
Shelter.
Shelter is a place that gives protection from the weather and or danger.
We all need shelter to keep us safe and warm.
That's right, Miss Delphine. Our last word, boys and girls, is tribes. Say it with me. Tribes. Tribes are groups of similar people who share common ancestors, customs, and laws.
There are many tribes of Native Americans living across the country.
Now, let's say each word again together. Okay, boys and girls, are you ready? Borrow, coast, deserts, roamed, tribes, shelter. Great job, boys and girls. As we read, these words will be referenced in today's Read Aloud.
Now let's listen to find out what the different tribes of Native Americans wore, what they ate, and what kinds of houses they lived in.
Long, long ago, Long before you and I can remember, long before our grandparents and their grandparents and their grandparents can remember, there were no people living on the land where we live today. There were rivers and lakes, but no people. There were woods and plains, but no people. There were deserts and mountains, but no people. There were plenty of birds and fish and animals and insects, but there were no people. But that was thousands of years ago, much earlier than any of us can remember. The first known people who lived in America, called Native Americans or American Indians, lived in all parts of the continent. Some lived in the desert, others lived in the mountains, some lived in the woods, and others lived on the coast near the ocean. People of the desert live very differently from coastal people. Can you guess why that would be? Boys and girls, you're giving great responses. You are going to learn about some of the different ways America's first known people, or Native Americans, lived. The Native Americans of long ago all needed the same things we need today. They needed food and water to stay alive. They needed shelter. These are places to protect them from the weather and wild animals. And they needed clothing to keep themselves warm and dry. So, what did the Native Americans need to live, boys and girls?
I remember you said Native Americans needed shelter, clothing, and food to live.
Boys and girls, and Miss Delphine, you all are absolutely correct.
Yay!
Let's continue our read aloud to learn some more. But the food the desert people ate was not the same kind of food the coastal people ate. And the houses that protected people in the woods did not look the same as the houses of those who lived in the desert. Some lived in teepees. Some lived in wheat tubes. Some lived in hogans. Some lived in pueblos. And others lived in longhouses. Native Americans of long ago had to rely on their knowledge of nature, of the earth, the plants, and the animals that surrounded them. And everywhere they roamed or wandered, these Native Americans found ways to borrow or use from the earth all they needed to live. Some Native Americans grew their own vegetables and fruit. Others hunted buffalo. Some Native Americans hunted woodland animals. Others caught fish from rivers, lakes, and oceans. Some Native Americans cooked their food over an open fire. Others baked food in specially made ovens. So, what were the different ways the Native Americans of long ago got their food?
Miss Nicole, the Native Americans hunted, grew fruits and vegetables, and caught fish.
Boys and girls, it's Miss Daphne. You all are absolutely correct.
Yay!
The Native Americans also needed water, but there were no sinks with running water inside their homes. So where do you think the Native Americans found water long ago? Let's read a little further to find out, boys and girls. Native Americans collected rainwater. They also got their water from lakes, rivers, and streams. Native Americans of long ago did not have cars and trucks. There were no buses or trains or planes. So do you remember how they got around? Long ago, Native Americans traveled by foot. Here, the word foot is being described as the part of your body that is at the end of your leg. Another type of foot is a measurement. You know, like when you use a ruler has 12 inches, and that 12 inches equals 1 foot. There were no paved roads. Native American paths were made by the pounding of their own footsteps and the hooves of animal herds. After Native Americans were here for many years, they started riding horses. After that, some traveled on horseback, and others traveled in canoes. Those who lived in the woods used their feet to make their way through thick forests of trees. After many years, those who lived on open plains welcomed the speed of horses to carry them long distances, and those who lived near lakes and rivers relied upon canoes to carry them across the waters. What do you see in this picture? No matter where they lived, Native Americans made all of their own clothes. Some Native American women and girls wore skirts and dresses. Men and boys often wore breechcloths and leggings, and they used materials from their surroundings to make their clothes. Do you see that in that picture? Now, what do you see in this picture? Some Native Americans wore clothing made of animal skin, elk, deer, buffalo, and rabbit. They often decorated their clothing with beads, porcupine quills, and fringe. During the cold winter months, they wore coats of animal fur to stay warm. Others wore clothes made from the soft inner bark of the cedar tree, sometimes decorated with seashells. Still, others wore clothing made of fibers from different plants, cotton and yucca, and trimmed them with animal bones. In winter, they covered themselves with cloaks made from sheep's wool to stay warm. Many men, women, boys, and girls in each of the Native American tribes across the land, from the ocean to the plains to the woods, wore moccasins on their feet. They also have the same ancestors, such as great-great-grandparents. Some, however, preferred bare feet. And so you see, the people who first came to live on this rich and varied land that we now call the United States of America were just as rich and varied as the land itself. They were alike in some ways and different in other ways, just as the people of America are today. Wow, boys and girls, we learned a lot about the Native American from today's Read Aloud. At this time, I would like to take a moment just to ask you some questions to see what you learned. When you give your response, try to answer in complete sentences by restating the question in your answer. Miss Delphine and I will demonstrate. Miss Delphine, what 3 things do all people need, including the Native Americans, need to live?
The 3 things Native Americans and all people need to live are food, clothing, and shelter.
Now, it's your turn. Listen closely to the next question and remember to give your response using a complete sentence as Ms. Delphine demonstrated. Here's our first question. Where did the Native Americans live? That's correct, boys and girls at home. The Native Americans lived along the coast, the plains, and in the desert. Here's our next question. How did Native Americans of long ago get their food? Boys and girls, did I hear you say the Native Americans of long ago farmed, hunted, and fished to get their food? You are absolutely correct. Okay, boys and girls, let's see if you can answer one more. What kinds of things did the Native Americans of long ago use to make clothes? Did I hear you say the Native Americans of long ago used animal skin, trees, and plants to make their clothes? Again, you are absolutely correct. Now, let's do our Think, Pair, Share activity. With this activity, boys and girls, I'm going to ask a question. I will give you a minute to think about the question. Then I will ask you to pair up with a family member or friend at home, then turn to that person and share. Share what you are thinking. Are you ready? Remember, think, pair, and then share. Here's our question. Which of the different types of Native American houses would you want to live in if you lived among the Native Americans long ago? Then tell why. Wow, boys and girls, you all are giving some great responses. Great job, boys and girls. You all have shared great information about the type of home you would like to live in and why. Now, let's move on to another part of our lesson. In today's read aloud, you heard Native Americans needed shelter and they needed clothing to keep themselves warm and dry. Say the word shelter with me, boys and girls. Shelter. Remember, a shelter is something that protects you from the weather or from danger. Two friends used the tree as shelter when it began to rain. What are other things you could use as a shelter? Great, boys and girls. You all are doing an awesome job. Now, we will show you some pictures from our read aloud. And I want you to decide if what is pictured could be a shelter or not. If you think it could be a shelter, say, that's a shelter. If you don't think it could be a shelter, say, that's not a shelter. Here's our first picture.
Miss Nicole, that's not a shelter. That's a buffalo.
Boys and girls at home and Miss Delphine, you all are absolutely correct. Because this is not a shelter, I'm going to place it here on our Making Choices anchor chart under not a shelter. Because you and Miss Delphine stated that this is a picture of buffalo. Here's our next picture.
That's a shelter. That's a teepee.
Boys and girls at home and Miss Delphine, you all are absolutely correct. This is a picture of a teepee, and yes, it is shelter. So I'm going to place it here on our Making Choices anchor chart under shelter. Here's our next picture. Did you say this was a shelter? Because if you did, you're absolutely correct. So we will place it here on our Making Choices anchor chart under shelter? Boys and girls, is this shelter or not?
Miss Nicole, that's not a shelter. Those are moccasins.
Miss Delphine and boys and girls at home, you are absolutely correct. This is not a shelter. These are moccasins. So we will place it here. Let's try one more. Can you tell me if this is a shelter or not?
That's a shelter. That is a Pueblo.
You're absolutely correct. Boys and girls and Miss Delphine, this is a shelter. Wow, you all have done an amazing job, boys and girls. So what is the word we've been talking about? Shelter. Say it with me.
Shelter.
Remember, we all need shelter just as the Native Americans of long ago did. Wow, you have worked so hard on today's lesson about the Native Americans. You did such a great job identifying all those things the Native Americans needed to survive. I am so proud of you, and you should be proud of you too. All rights and credits for today's lesson belong to Core Knowledge Language Arts. We would like to thank them for publicly sharing these valuable resources. Share something you learned from today's lesson with your family and friends at home. And until next time, boys and girls, goodbye.
Goodbye.